Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Thursday. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who's with us? It's great when you comment right at the top of the show, whether to say hello or tell us what city you're tuning in from. Anything, the more comments that come in right at the top, and shares even better. If you share it on your own page, more people see the class, right? There's so many people who would benefit from the class. They should at least have the choice whether to join or not to become aware of it, right? So comments and shares right at the top help the class reach more people in the social media world. All right, who's with us? Bill in mid-Missouri, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandor in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Belle in Texas. Please keep our daughter in your prayers. She's in the hospital with meningitis. Belle, may your daughter have a refuah shlema, a complete healing, and may it be speedy. And we say amen. John in Surfside Beach, South Carolina, who asks us to pray for Bud. May Bud get the salvation he needs. Peggy in Colorado, Fred in Kentucky, Nancy in North Carolina. Woohoo, I'm on time, she says. Pam saying good evening from Oregon. Christo in Lubbock, Texas. Just finished meeting with my Harusa. We're close to finishing the book of Proverbs. Yasher Koach, may you be strengthened to begin and complete many books. Mikey in Dallas, Ray in Ohio, Sharon, my dogs go crazy with the birds, the jungle sounds that we play at the beginning of the show. So glad. Jill in New York City, Rebecca in Florida, Jonathan in Southern California. Peggy, where is the share button? There's usually a share right there next to the show, like a curved arrow. That's the share button. Diana in New York, Stephen in New Hampshire, Josette in Colorado. Over there on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida, Ella says shalom, Marie in Long Island, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome everybody. We have a really interesting class tonight. Let's get into it. We are finishing page 44, and then tonight's daf is 45, Mem Hey, here in chapter 6 of Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud. Here in chapter 6, we're getting back to some of the basics, the basic requirements of the oath of nazirus and how to fulfill them and the nuances thereof. Yesterday, we read Mishna number 7 at the end of the class, which concerns the shaving, right? So that the Nazir cannot remove any of his hair while he is a Nazir during his days of Nazirus as he fulfills his oath of Nazirus, as we talked about at the end and have repeated a few times. First of all, you can't do Nazirus. You can't take an oath of Nazirus when the temple is not standing because you have to bring offerings at the end of that term. So you can't do it now, even when the temple is standing. It hasn't been for 2,000 years, but God willing, Mashiach will come. The third temple will go up. It would then be possible to do an oath of Nazirus, but it's still discouraged by the sages because there's so many ways to get it wrong, and it's unnecessary, and there's no reason to forego something that is permitted, like the product of the grapevine. At any rate, if you take that oath of Nazirus, then you can't remove any of your hair during those days that you're counting to fulfill the oath. And at the completion, then you shave off all the hair on your head and bring the offerings. And we'll talk about the order of that today. And also, if a Nazir becomes impure, if he violates that other prohibition, he cannot become impure for the dead during his days of Nazirus, enter a cemetery, participate in a funeral, help embalm a body. He's not allowed to do that. even for a close relative. But if he does, or if it happens to him accidentally, so then he has to shave and bring the offerings of impurity, right? The offerings of impurity, and then, as we know, he has to reset the count of days for himself. So there's two kinds of shaving that a Nazir can do: at the conclusion of his days and during his days, if he becomes impure for the dead, and then he has to reset the counter of days, as it were. Okay, so we read yesterday that our Mishnah number 7 is that with regard to the shaving of ritual impurity, meaning he became impure while he was a Nazir. So how would it proceed? We don't have to cover the whole Mishnah again. But if you become impure for the dead, whether you're a Nazir or not, if you're going to go to the temple, you have to go through a purification ceremony that involves a 7-day purification with sprinkling with the waters that contain the ashes of the red heifer on the 3rd and 7th days, and then an immersion in the mikveh. Then you will wait nightfall. And so how do they count the days? And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon have a bit of a dispute on when is he actually completed the days and when he does the shaving. Okay, so we go to the Gemara on this Mishnah number 7, and we're near the bottom of page 44b. The Gemara asks, did Rabbi Tarfon accept this claim from Rabbi Akiva in their dispute about, do you bring the offerings on the 8th day or on the 9th day? Did Rabbi Tarfon accept this claim from Rabbi Akiva, or did he not accept it? So come in here and answer to this from that which Hillel the Amora taught, right? So Hillel, the Hillel that we usually think about, Hillel the elder, as in Hillel and Shammai, well, they were earlier sages that were alive during the Second Temple period, so they would not be Amoraim, they would be Tanaim, right? Rabbis of the Mishnaic period. So if we're talking about Hillel the Amora, that's a rabbi of the Gemara period, and that is a later Hillel, right? A much later Hillel. So Hillel the Amora taught, if a Nazir shaved on the 8th day, he brings his offerings on the 9th. And if it should enter your mind that Rabbi Tarfon accepted the claim from Rabbi Akiva, so let the Nazir bring his offerings on the 8th day itself in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So rather, this Baraisa is certainly in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, who remains steadfast in his rejection of Rabbi Akiva's opinion. And again, just to review, so they sprinkle him on the 3rd and 7th days, and then he shaves his hair. This is a Nazir who became impure for the dead, and he shaves his hair on the 7th day, and he brings the offerings of an impure Nazir on the 8th day. And if he waited and shaved on the 8th day, he still brings his offerings on that day, and that's the statement of Rabbi Akiva. But Rabbi Tarfon says, what is the difference between this ritual and that of the Mitzorah? A Mitzorah, one who became impure through Tzara'as, a Mitzorah also shaves on the 7th day and sacrifices his offerings on the 8th. However, if a Mitzorah shaves on the 8th day, he brings his offerings on the 9th day, not on the day of his shaving, right? You bring those offerings, and then the next day, or you shave it, and then you bring your offerings on the next day. So Rabbi Akiva says, no, if you wait till the 8th day, you can shave and bring offerings on the same day. Rabbi Tarfon says, if you shave on the 8th day, you bring your offerings on the 9th day. That's the dispute between Akiva and Tarfon. So Rava said, this is not difficult. It is possible that Rabbi Tarfon accepted Rabbi Akiva's opinion with regard to a Nazir who shaved on the 8th day. And there's a difference between the two statements. In this case of our Mishnah, it is referring to a Nazir who immersed on the 7th day, right? So he became impure for the dead while he was a Nazir. He went through that 7-day purification. He was sprinkled the second time on the 7th day. He's sprinkled on the 3rd day and the 7th day. That happened. And then he immersed on the 7th day, which is the standard purification for when he becomes impure for the dead, which means that he is entirely pure on the 8th. Once you immerse in the mikvah, and then nightfall comes on the 7th day, meaning the 8th day has begun, this person, a normal person, who, the normal case of somebody who became impure for the dead, he receives his sprinklings, he waits 7 days, he immerses on the 7th day. When the 8th day begins at nightfall after the 7th day, because Hebrew days begin at nightfall, that person is completely pure. Right? So in this case, the Mishnah is referring to a Nazir who immersed on the 7th day, which means that he's entirely pure on the 8th, and he can therefore bring his offerings on the same day after shaving. By contrast, in that case of Hillel's Baraisa, it is referring to one who did not immerse on the 7th. Consequently, as he immerses on the 8th day, he may sacrifice his offerings only after sunset, which is the 9th day, right? So for the Nazir who has to bring offerings, he has to wait until he has become purified, the 7 days, and then the immersion. But if he didn't immerse on the 7th day and he only immerses on the 8th day, then really the point of dispute between Akiva and Tarfon is, does he have to wait yet another day before he can bring his offerings? Right? If he shaves on the 8th day, does he have to now await another nightfall, meaning the 9th day, and only then can he bring his offerings? That's Tarfon. Or Akiva, well, now that he has already shaved on the 8th day and he completed his purification on the previous day, the 7th day, why can't he bring his offerings on the same day he shaves? That's Akiva. So Abaye said, I encountered the members of the assembly of Rav Nasan bar Hoshaya sitting and saying the following. The verse states with regard to a man who experiences a gonorrhea-like discharge. This man is called a Zav. And he also has a purification process. This has nothing to do with being a Nazir. It can happen to a Nazir, but a man who experiences this kind of discharge has to go through a purification before he, if he's a priest, before he can eat consecrated food, or if he's a Levite or an Israelite, before he can enter the Temple Mount. Right? So a Zav immerses on the 7th day of his purification. And then, quote, on the 8th day he shall take for himself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and come before the Lord to the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them the offerings to the priest. That's Leviticus 15:14. Now, when does he come to the courtyard? When does the Zav come to the courtyard to sacrifice his offerings? Only when he has immersed on the 7th day and perform the requirement to wait until sunset. So in that case, yes, he brings his offerings. But if he has not immersed and has not performed the requirement to wait until sunset, no, he may not enter the courtyard. Now, apparently, this Tana of the Baraisa that we just read maintains that one who immersed himself that day to release himself from the status of a Zav is considered like an actual Zav. Just as a Zav is prohibited from entering the Levite camp in his state of impurity, the same applies to him on the day of his immersion. He must still wait until after sunset when he is entirely pure. Now, a few words of background here. What's the Levite camp? So when the children of Israel came out of Egypt and we wandered in the desert, was supposed to be, a year, maybe 2 years, ended up being 40 years because of our terrible behavior during that period, okay? But at any rate, during the wanderings in the desert, so there were 3 camps, right? So there was this massive, imagine 2 million people on a camping trip that lasts 40 years. It's hard to understand, hard to fathom, but that's what happened. So they were considered to be 3 camps, meaning 3 layers of holiness, of ascending holiness, right? So there's the whole encampment. That's the Israelite camp. 2 million people. Beyond the camp is just the wilderness, right? So beyond the encampment is the wilderness. And certain people would be banished outside the camp, right? Somebody with Sara'as would have to spend some time outside the camp. Now, so once you get into the Israelite camp, that's a large area, right, where 2 million people fit. Some say 3 million. Then as you get to the center of the camp, now there was an array, the way that they encamped, right, there were 12 tribes, and there were 13 in a sense because the Levite tribe was removed from the other 11 tribes. So you would think that there were 11 tribes surrounding the Levite camp. But there were 12 tribes surrounding the Levite camp because Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, became 2 different camps, right? Or, their descendants became 2 different camps. So there was 3 in the north, 3 in the east, 3 in the south, and 3 tribes encamped in the west. And that whole thing was the Israelite camp. in the middle of that was the Levite camp, right? The Levites had the charge of attending to all the accoutrement of the tabernacle, right? The Mishkan in the wilderness. They would carry it when we were on the move. And then once we set up camp, the Levites, encamped themselves around the inner camp, right? Which is the tent of meeting. So that was the tabernacle itself. So the Levite camp surrounds the camp of the divine presence. And the camp of the divine presence is the tabernacle itself, where only the Kohanim, the priests, could enter, right? So in terms of ascending sanctity, it was the wilderness, like the whole world, then the Israelite camp, then the Levite camp, and then the tent of meeting, or the tent or the camp of the divine presence, right? Where the divine presence, the Shekinah, was understood to rest on the tabernacle. Right? And then different people, depending on their state of purity, could enter the Levite camp, but only the priest could enter the camp of the divine presence, also known as the tent of meeting or the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Okay. Now, once we entered the promised land, so then they established the Mishkan, and it lasted for 400 years in a few different locations, primarily in Shiloh. And eventually in Jerusalem. And then Solomon built the temple on the Temple Mount, and that was the first temple, and it stood for 410 years, I believe. And then it was destroyed, 70 years of exile. And then the second temple also stood on the Temple Mount for, I believe, 420 years. Now, once we have the temple constructed in Jerusalem, the Israelite camp, the Levite camp, and the camp of the divine presence are understood to now correspond to Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem is the Israelite camp. The Temple Mount, the whole plaza of the Temple Mount, is the Levite camp. And then the temple itself and its immediate courtyard are the camp of the divine presence. That's going to become very relevant today in our discussion. Okay, so now you understand, right? Israelite camp, Levite camp, camp of the divine presence, and later that's going to correspond to Jerusalem, Temple Mount, temple itself, and its immediate courtyard. Okay, so where was I? So, apparently, this Tana maintains that one who immersed himself that day to release himself from the status of a Zav is considered like an actual Zav. And just as a Zav, a man who has experienced gonorrhea-like discharge, is prohibited from entering the Levite camp, right? The Levite camp corresponds to the Temple Mount in his state of impurity. The same applies to him on the day of his immersion. Even though he's completed his purification process and immersed, he still can't enter the Temple Mount until nightfall comes after his immersion. Now Abaye adds, upon hearing this, I said to those sages, if that is so, with regard to an impure Nazir, meaning a Nazir that became impure for the dead and has to bring his offerings and go through his 7-day purification and then shave his head, right? When does he bring those offerings? That's what we're talking about. So Abaye says, upon hearing this, I said to those sages, if that is so, with regard to an impure Nazir also, as it is written, and he shall bring them, referring to the verse, and on the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons to the priest to the entrance of the tent of meeting. Similar language to the Zav. So this can be explained in a similar manner. When does he come to the courtyard to sacrifice his offerings? When he has immersed himself and waited until sunset, right? Until nightfall on the day that he immersed. Now we're on 45a. So Abaye continues. Now, consider the gate of Nicanor, where all those lacking atonement stand to bring their offerings. Lacking atonement means they've gone through their purification, they've immersed, they've waited for nightfall, but they haven't yet brought their offerings. They've done everything else but bring their offerings. That's why they're allowed to get to the gate of Nicanor, because they've done everything else. They only haven't brought their offerings. Where is it located? In the gates of the Levites. The 3 camps are detailed in the verses, each having its own restrictions as to who may or may not enter them. We see that at Numbers chapter 5. So the verses speak of the camps of the Jewish people in the wilderness, and the sages taught that the statuses of certain areas of Jerusalem corresponded to those camps. The camps in the wilderness were the Israelite camp, the Levite camp, and the camp of the divine presence. And they corresponded to Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and the temple itself. And the gate of Nicanor had the status of the Levite camp, meaning the status of the rest of the Temple Mount. Here's the temple. All right? Here's the temple. Now, the Temple Mount would be, the huge plaza surrounding all of this, right? And like when you go in Jerusalem now and you visit the Kotel or the Kosel, right? The Western Wall, sometimes called the Wailing Wall, that is the Western Wall, right? Which is actually back here, right? This is the temple up on the mount, and then there was like the mount just extended all around the temple and its immediate environs, and there was a wall over here, right? And it's that wall that we now worship at. That's all that's left. Right, so now, but the Temple Mount was this whole area, and all of this is the Temple Mount, and that's considered the camp of the Levites. So where's the camp of the divine presence? So the camp of the divine presence is the temple itself. So that's this is the temple itself, and there's the sanctuary. Inside would be the menorah and the incense altar, and then in the back of that is the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was housed during the tabernacle days and the first temple days. By the second temple, the Ark of the Covenant was not there. At any rate, this is the camp of the divine presence, and this is the gate of Nicanor that we will be talking about today. Right here, these round steps. That's the gate of Nicanor, and you go through there, right, into what's called the camp of the Israelites, the courtyard of the Israelites, and then beyond, right? And in here, this is the camp of the divine presence, right, where only priests are allowed to go there. This is called the women's courtyard, mostly because it had these balconies where the women would go. In the early days, the women would go through here, but there was a little bit too much mixing of men and women, and so that was nixed. At any rate, this gate of Nicanor, which is at the top of these steps, has the status of the entire Temple Mount, right? You only, when you go through that gate there, are you entering the sanctuary and the camp of the divine presence. All right, so now you have a bit of a mental picture of what we're talking about. Now, Abaya continues. And so what they're discussing is, right, when does the Nazir who became impure for the dead and has to go through his purification and then shave, when does he bring those offerings? Now, since there seems to be very similar language to the purification process of a Zav, right? And a Zav, even after he completes his 7-day purification and immerses, he still has to wait until the 8th day before he's allowed to enter past the gate of Nicanor. So maybe it's going to be the same for the Nazir who became impure. But as we'll see, the Zav has his own stringency. And the reason that the Zav has its own stringency, which in some ways is even more stringent than the Nazir who became impure, is because the Zav is impure from a discharge that came from his own body. And that's why he's not going to be allowed anywhere on the Temple Mount until he has completed the whole 7 days and it has become the 8th day. Whereas the Nazir who became impure for the dead, he has impurity of the dead, but once he does all the purification ritual of that and immerses, he is going to be allowed to enter the Temple Mount because his impurity was external, it wasn't internal. That's the rationale that's given in the notes. Now, Abaye continues, but isn't it taught in a Baraisa that one who is impure due to contact with a corpse is permitted to enter the Levite camp, meaning is permitted to enter the Temple Mount? And not only one impure from a corpse, but even a corpse itself may be brought inside the Levite camp and therefore onto the Temple Mount. How do we know that? Because, as it is stated, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. Exodus 13:19, when the children of Israel left slavery in Egypt and went out, to Mount Sinai and then eventually wandered around before entering the promised land, Moses was carrying with him the bones of Joseph, right? Or at least, he was not on his person, but he caused to be brought with him, and it was kept, in some kind of a safe storage place within the Levite camp. If you entered that tent that had the bones in it, I guess you would get corpse tuma from the bones. But at any rate, they were carrying the bones of Joseph because Joseph had asked, when you leave Egypt, bring my bones up with you that I may be buried in the Holy Land, right? So since Moses was a Levite, and he was living in the Levite camp, and he brought with him the bones of Joseph, it must be that a corpse is allowed in the Levite camp, and thus a corpse and somebody with corpse impurity is allowed on the Temple Mount, unlike the Zav, who cannot enter the Temple Mount until he's completed in every way his purification and awaited nightfall on the seventh day, and it's become the eighth day for him, right? So says Abaye, even a corpse itself may be brought inside the Levite camp, as it is stated, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. And the Bryce explains, what is the meaning of with him? The phrase with him indicates that Joseph's bones were taken within Moses' boundary with him in the Levite camp. And this demonstrates that even a corpse may be brought into the Levite camp. So if so, certainly a Nazir who is impure from contact with a corpse and who has been sprinkled and immersed may enter there. Consequently, the law that a Nazir must wait until the eighth day to sacrifice his offerings cannot be due to a prohibition against entering the gate of Nicanor. One can similarly infer that the halacha, that a Zav who has immersed may not bring his offerings before the eighth day, is not because he is prohibited from entering the gate of Nicanor. So, according to the view of Abaye. So rather, Abaye says the Baraisa should be understood slightly differently than suggested by the assembly of Rav Nassan bar Hoshaya. One who immersed himself that day to release himself from the status of a Zav, i.e. a full-fledged Zav who experienced 3 emissions, not merely 2, is considered like a Zav with regard to the prohibition against entering the Levite camp. But the reason for this prohibition is not that a Zav who immersed himself that day may not enter the Levite camp. Rather, granted that he is permitted to enter the Levite camp in terms of his impurity, even so, since he is lacking atonement, as he has yet to sacrifice his offerings, he may not enter the Levite camp. But an impure Nazir who's in the process of bringing offerings can enter the Temple Mount. The Zav cannot until he's completely finished everything. So Abaye elaborates, and the reason that he may not enter is that the Torah states with regard to a Zav, and he shall come before the Lord to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And if he is standing in the Levite camp at the gate of Nicanor, when he brings his offerings, why does the Torah call it the tent of meeting? Rather, the verse must be coming to say that just as there, with regard to the tent of meeting itself, meaning the camp of the divine presence, one who is lacking atonement may not enter there. So too, with regard to the Levite camp as well, one who is lacking atonement may not enter there. And the Gemara asks, well, and from where do we derive that one who lacks atonement may not enter there, meaning the camp of the divine presence? And the Gemara answers, as it is taught in the Baraisa. The Torah states, with regard to the prohibition against an impure person entering the tabernacle, he shall be impure, his impurity is yet upon him. And the phrase, he shall be impure, serves to include one who immersed himself that day in the prohibition against entering the temple. His impurity is still upon him. Serves to include one who lacks atonement, i.e., who is prohibited from entering the camp of the divine presence until he has sacrificed his offerings of purity. Now, when we're talking about entering the temple itself, only a priest can enter there anyway. So even a priest who is impure cannot enter until he completes his purification. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 7. Here's Mishnah number 8. With regard to a Nazir's shaving of purity. Mishnah number 7 was about a Nazir who became impure for the dead, and when does he bring his offerings, and when does he shave for his impurity and reset his count of days. Now we're talking about a Nazir who completed his days of nazirus, and he's going to bring the conclusion offerings, right? His offerings at the end of nazirus, so that he can finish being a nazir and get back to being a regular person who can drink wine if he wants to, who can eat grapes if he wants to, who can cut his hair when he wants to, and who can attend a funeral if he wants to. But he can't do those things until he completes his nazirus, and he's going to bring the offerings of impurity, the offerings of purity, the offerings at the conclusion, and he's going to have to shave his head at the end of that process. So when exactly does he shave within, vis-a-vis bringing those final offerings? Where does the shaving fall among those offerings? So with regard to a nazir's shaving of purity after the completion of his term of nazirus, how is it performed? So he would bring 3 animals, one for a sin offering, one for a burnt offering, and one for a peace offering. That's what the Torah demands. And he slaughters the peace offering and shaves his hair after he slaughters them. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Elazar says he would shave only after he slaughtered the sin offering, as the sin offering precedes the other offerings in all places, and therefore he sacrifices the sin offering first. And he shaves his hair and he slaughters his offering. And if he shaved after the sacrifice of any of the 3 of them, he has fulfilled his obligation after the fact. What he should do is bring the sin offering, then shave his hair, then bring the other offerings, the burnt offering and the peace offering. But if he brought any one of the 3 offerings and then shaved his hair and then brought the other 2 offerings, he didn't do it the right way, the perfect way, the ideal way, but he has fulfilled his obligation. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if a Nazir brought 3 animals without specifying which of them was for which offering, we learn this. The one that is fit for a sin offering, which is a female sheep in its first year, is sacrificed as a sin offering. That which is fit for a burnt offering, which is a male sheep in its first year, is sacrificed as the burnt offering. And that which is fit for a peace offering, a ram, meaning a male sheep over the age of 1 year, this is sacrificed as the peace offering. Makes sense. That's Mishnah number 8. Here comes the Gemara. The Gemara first addresses the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, whose reasoning was not stated in the Mishnah. The sages taught that when the Torah states, and the Nazir shall shave his consecrated head at the entrance to the tent of meeting, that's Numbers 6:18, the verse is speaking of the peace offering, as the phrase, the entrance to the tent of meeting, alludes to a peace offering. How do we know that? As it is stated in Leviticus 3, verse 1. And if his offering is a sacrifice of a peace offering, he shall slaughter it at the entrance of the tent of meeting, at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So, do you say that the verse is speaking of the peace offering, i.e. that the Nazir shaves after bringing his peace offering? Or perhaps this is only teaching that the place where he shaves is the actual entrance to the tent of meeting, at the gate to the sanctuary, as indicated by a literal reading of the verse. And you can say in response, if so, that is a degrading manner of service to shave at the entrance to the sanctuary. Are you telling me that a Nazir is going to have to go inside the camp of the divine presence to the entrance of the tent of meeting, which in the temple is the entrance to the sanctuary? And that's where he's going to do his shaving, with a razor and soap and water? Is this a place for people to go shave themselves? Of course not. That would be degrading to the temple. So if they're saying that he shaves at the entrance to the tent of meeting, what they mean is he shaves, at the time that the peace offering is brought. Where do the Nazirs actually do their shaving? Way out here, which is considered just part of the Temple Mount. I can't remember right now if it's this one or this one, but I believe it's this one, and that is the chamber of the Nazirim, right? The place where the Nazir goes and does his shaving. So Rabbi Yoshaya says, this proof is not necessary, as the Torah states, and you shall not ascend by steps to my altar. We read that Exodus 20:23, so that you should not reveal your nakedness upon it. So if the Torah is concerned about the disrespect to the altar, the Mizbeach, right? The altar is right here where the sacrifices are brought. Only priests can be in here, but the point is that the ramp up to the altar had to be a ramp and not steps. Because says the Torah, you can't walk up steps because when you lift your knees in the manner of walking up a flight of stairs, and they didn't wear underwear. They had kind of those long, garments that were open at the bottom, almost like dresses. That would, sort of disrespect the holiness of the altar because their nakedness. That's what the Torah says, that the priest's nakedness would be more exposed than if they walked up a straight ramp. And that's why there's no steps on the rise to the altar, only a ramp. Right? So now that we know that even it's degrading to the altar and the sanctuary and the tent of meeting, meaning the camp of the divine presence, just to lift your knees up, which is just the normal way of walking, when you're going up something, if that's going to be considered degrading, then certainly, bringing out your shaving bowl and your water and soap is something that you don't do in the camp of the divine presence. And a different version of this derivation is stated in the Midrash to the Torah portion Naso, where the Torah states, "And the Nazir shall shave his consecrated head at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and shall take the hair of his consecrated head and put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offering." So Rabbi Yoshaya says, the verse is speaking of the peace offering. Or perhaps there's only teaching that he shaves at the actual entrance to the tent of meeting where a peace offering is brought. So if so, the Torah said, "And you shall not ascend by steps to my altar." And by Kal v'chomer inference, with regard to this matter, it is derived that he should not shave at the entrance of the tent of meeting. If it's degrading just to walk upstairs, how much more degrading to actually shave and perform your ablutions in that place? So we don't allow it. So rather, the verse is speaking of, when it talks about at the entrance of the tent of meeting, it just means that he shaves or he brings the hair of his shaving in conjunction with the peace offering. So Rabbi Yitzhak says, it is not necessary to cite an indirect proof that a Nazir may not shave at the entrance to the sanctuary, as the verse states with regard to a Nazir. "And he shall take the hair of his consecrated head and put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offering." That's stated directly at Numbers 6:18. So the verse is referring to one who has not yet performed only the stages of taking and placing his shaven hair under the pot of the peace offering, which is outside the sanctuary. Remember, when he completes his nazirus and he brings these three offerings to the temple, sin offering, burnt offering, peace offering, what happens? The animals are slaughtered. Some of it goes up in smoke on the altar. Some of it, blood gets sprinkled. And then what? The burnt offering goes up entirely on the altar. The sin offering, parts of it are burned on the altar and parts of it are eaten by priests. Only priests can eat the edible part of the sin offering. The peace offering is eaten by the person who brought the offering. So he's going to have those animals slaughtered. He shaves his head after the sin offering. Then he has the other animals slaughtered. The burnt offering is burnt on the altar. The sin offering, pieces that are going to be eaten, are given to the priests. And then the peace offering, right, that animal was slaughtered, blood sprinkled on the altar. And now it's going to be cooked so that he can eat it. And when it's cooked, so his hair that he shaves off his head for the conclusion of his nazirus, he actually throws that hair in the fire under the peace offering. Now, some say a different version of this statement. Rabbi Yitzhak says the verse is referring to the peace offering, and he clarifies his assertion. Do you say that the verse is speaking of the peace offering, or is it teaching only that he shaves at the actual entrance of the tent of meeting? And the verse states, "And he shall take the hair of his consecrated head and put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offering." And this indicates that in the same place where he would cook the peace offering outside the courtyard, there he would shave. Abba Hanan says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer that the verse, "And the Nazir shall shave his consecrated head at the entrance of the tent of meeting," is referring to the time rather than the place of his shaving. Meaning the verse is teaching that as long as the entrance to the tent of meeting is not open, he may not shave. He may shave only during those hours when the entrance to the sanctuary is open. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says, and and the phrase, and the Nazir shall shave his consecrated head at the entrance to the tent of meeting, does not refer to the place of his shaving. Rather, the masculine form of the word Nazir serves to emphasize that this applies to a male Nazir and not a female Nazir. A woman does not shave her head in the sanctuary, lest the young priests, now on 45b, the young priests who are present will become aroused by her when she uncovers her hair in their presence. Now, one of the other sages said to Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, according to your statement, the case of the sota will prove that this is not a concern. The sota is the suspected adulteress, and her ritual was to be brought to the temple along with her husband and a chaperone, because since the husband and his wife, the suspected adulteress, become prohibited to each other once she becomes a sota. They have to go to Jerusalem. She's going to go through the ritual of drinking the waters of bitterness, which includes, some dirt from the temple courtyard and the words of the sota verses in the Torah written on a parchment and then dissolved in the water. And then she drinks that water as part of this ritual. And if she really committed adultery, then those waters will poison her and she'll die. But if she's innocent, then she'll live and in fact will be fertile, right? Even like a woman who was unable to bear children will be able to bear children. That's a whole discussion for another day. But the point is that part of that ritual of the sota, drinking the waters of bitterness, is that her hair would be uncovered in the temple courtyard. Now, if the female Nazir, like the male Nazir, has to shave hair at the, in the temple courtyard, so then the hair has to be uncovered for the process of shaving. Right? But women's hair is always covered because it's considered extremely sexual for their hair to be uncovered and to be showing. So they said, well, obviously women Nazirim, naziros, right? Naziresses, right? Whatever. Women Nazirs, would have to shave in a private place lest they uncover their hair prior to the shaving and arouse the young priests who would be present there. Okay. So that's what Shimon Shazuri says. But then the other sages there say, wait a minute, the sota uncovered her hair. We're not concerned that the young priests are going to be aroused by that. And we know that her hair was uncovered in that location. So according to your statement, the case of the sota will prove that this is not a concern, as it is written with regard to her, Numbers 5:16, and he shall set her before the Lord. And yet we are not concerned that perhaps the young priest will become aroused by her when her hair is uncovered. And Rabbi Shimon Shazuri answered them, well, there's a difference between a female Nazir and a sota. This one, the Nazir, paints her eyes blue and applies blush to her face, and therefore there is a concern that young priests might be aroused by her beautiful appearance. By contrast, that one, the sota, does not put on blue eyeshadow or apply blush, since the sota is not beautified when she goes to the temple, but rather is made to appear wretched and look disheveled. There is no concern that she might arouse the men. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 8. Here's Mishnah number 9 here in chapter 6. After the Nazir shaved off his hair, he would take the hair of his consecrated head and throw it under the pot in which the peace offering was cooked, where it would burn. And if the Nazir shaved in the rest of the country, meaning he shaved outside the temple, he should have waited till he came to the temple to do his shaving, but if he did it before he came to the temple, he would not throw the hair under the pot. Now, in what case is this statement said? It is said with regard to the shaving of purity. However, with regard to the shaving of impurity, right? Remember, a Nazir who becomes impure for the dead has to shave his head and start his clock over again, but he doesn't bring the final offerings, he brings the offerings of impurity. The Nazir who completed his days of Nazirus brings the offerings of purity, and he also shaves his head for that one last time. So, who throws the hair that he shaved off his head under the pot of the peace offering? the Nazir who completes his nazirus. That's what we're learning here. With regard to the shaving of impurity, i.e. the shaving that accompanied his guilt offering and sin offering of birds after his term of nazirus was interrupted by becoming impure for the dead, he would not throw his hair under the pot in which his offerings were cooked, as the Torah stated this requirement only of a pure Nazir, meaning a Nazir who completed his nazirus. So Rabbi Meir says everyone throws his hair under the pot, including a pure Nazir who shaved outside the temple and an impure Nazir, with the only exception being an impure Nazir who shaved outside of the Temple Mount. Outside of the Temple Mount. In that case alone, he refrains from throwing his hair to be burned beneath his offering. Now that's interesting because if we're talking about a guilt offering or a sin offering, those, he's not going to eat of that. Only a priest can eat of that. It's only the peace offering that he himself will eat out of. And it's the Nazir, the Nazir who brings the offerings of the Nazir who brings the offerings of purity, who really is the one who's going to end up throwing his hair under the pot. It would be kind of weird to throw his hair under the pot in which, the meat would be cooked for the priest to eat, the sin offering. At any rate, that's Mishnah number 9. Here comes the Gemara. The Mishnah states that he would take the hair of his consecrated head. And the sages taught. And afterward, after cooking the peace offering, he takes the gravy, Hebrew rotev, in which the offering had been cooked, and he places it on the shaven hair of his consecrated head, and he throws the hair under the pot of his peace offering. This is pretty interesting. First of all, when they talk about gravy, they don't mean like gravy that we have in a gravy boat on the table. They just mean the juice that oozes out of meat when you roast it over fire. That's what they mean by gravy. And they mix some of that, juice that oozes out of the meat with the hair, and then they throw that mix into the fire itself under the pot. And I'm glad they do that, because if you've ever smelled hair burning, it's kind of gross, right? But if you mix it with the gravy of the meat, I think that's going to take care of the smell of burning hair. That's not the reason they do it, as we'll see, but it's nice that they do that. And if he threw his hair under the pot of the sin offering or the guilt offering, he has fulfilled his obligation after the fact. He's supposed to throw it under the peace offering, but even if he threw it under the sin offering or the guilt offering, he has fulfilled his obligation. Now, sin offering is both for the impure Nazir and the pure Nazir. Guilt offering is only for the impure Nazir. Now, the Gemara expresses surprise at this statement. Is there a guilt offering brought by a pure Nazir? Only an impure Nazir brings a guilt offering. So Rava said that this is what the Tana said, meaning this is what he meant. And if an impure Nazir threw his hair under the pot of the guilt offering, he has fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived, that he must pour gravy from the offering over the hair before he throws it in the fire? And Rava said, because the verse states, and he shall take the hair of his consecrated head and put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offering. And this indicates that part of his sacrifice must be under the hair. Put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offering. I don't know why they read it that way, but that's how they read it. So with regard to the statement of the Baraisa, and if he threw his hair under the pot of the sin offering, he has fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara asks, what is the reason for this? And the Gemara answers that the verse states the sacrifice of the peace offering, when it could have simply stated the peace offering. And this serves to include the sin offering and the guilt offering, which are also sacrifices. And the Gemara asks, but you have already derived from this term sacrifice that he must pour part of the gravy of the peace offering over his hair. And the Gemara answers, if so, let the verse say explicitly from the gravy of the peace offering. Why does it state sacrifice? Learn from here that it serves to include the sin offering and the guilt offering. And this verse teaches that when he throws his hair in the fire under the pot, he mixes some of the meat juice with it. I'm almost done. If you have questions or comments, get them in. The Gemara answers this statement from a different perspective, and one can say that the verse comes entirely to teach about the sin offering and the guilt offering, and it does not refer to the gravy at all. And the Gemara answers, well, if so, let it state peace offering and a sacrifice. For what reason does it write the sacrifice of the peace offering? Conclude two conclusions from the verse. And finally, in our discussion of Mishnah number 9, the sages taught all Nazirim would throw their hair under the pot, except for an impure Nazir who shaved outside the Temple Mount, because that one's hair is buried. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says pure Nazirim, whether they are here or there, meaning whether they shaved inside or outside the temple, they would throw their hair under the pot. Impure Nazirim, whether here or there, would not throw their hair under the pot. That's only for the final offerings when you complete nazirus. When you bring the offerings of impurity because you interrupted your nazirus, you don't throw your hair under the pot. And the rabbis say none would throw their hair under the pot except for a pure Nazir, meaning one at the conclusion of his nazirus, and who shaved his hair in the temple, because only in that case is the mitzvah performed properly as commanded by the Torah. All right, we covered a lot of ground today. Let's see if there are any questions or comments here on Nazir 45. Jonathan, question. Given the absence of the temple, is it still incumbent on Kohanim to avoid cemeteries? Yes. For close relatives, they can, a Kohen can become impure for very close relatives. So they can enter the cemetery, when God forbid their parents die, or for other very close relatives. But otherwise, a Kohen doesn't enter a cemetery. That's still true. What about the issue that it is not at all clear who is really a Kohen anymore due to loss of data in the diaspora? Well, basically, who's a Kohen? One who was told by his father that he's a Kohen. That's really it. We don't have any other objective way to establish who's a Kohen and who's not. Even if your name is Kohen, you're not necessarily a Kohen. But basically, yes, sometimes the tradition was lost, right? There was a Kohen who just became disconnected from Torah, forgot that he was a Kohen, had children, didn't tell them that they were Kohanim, and they weren't able to trace back, to a relative that was established as a Kohen through a paternal line and Jewish moms. And so, the information gets lost. So who is a Kohen? One, whose father was a Kohen and who told him you're a Kohen. Or he was able to establish, that his father or his grandfather was a Kohen and that he's a Jew born of a Jewish mom. Otherwise, they're not Kohanim. So these are the people who are concerned about, whether they enter a cemetery or not, or whether they can bless the congregation on holidays or not, etc. Or who takes the Kohen Aliyah when we do the Torah reading in synagogue. The first Aliyah is always given to a Kohen. But you only know that you're a Kohen, if your dad told you were a Kohen, or if you were to establish that your father was a Kohen. Jonathan. Right, I understand. Okay, I guess there was a little discussion in the comments. So Jonathan follows up and says, right, I understand that it is a minhag, a custom. I've seen similar things. I'm wondering if it is more than a minhag, right? More than a custom. My thinking was, it is law for the Kohanim of the temple period when there was a temple. But for the same reasons you can't be a Nazir anymore since the temple doesn't stand, is this behavior a custom of the community but not a halacha accepted by all who follow halacha? Being a Yisrael, I have no family learning to lean on here. Is it a custom not to enter a cemetery for a Kohen, or is it a law? I understand it's a law, but I'm not a rabbi, and I could be wrong. We also know that we're sort of all impure, right? Everyone right now in the world is assumed to be impure because we don't know where dead bodies are buried. Even without entering a cemetery, we might have walked over a grave somewhere. Not all the graves are marked in the world. We don't have the red heifer, so we can't go through a purification. So we're all assumed to be impure for the dead. And I think maybe that's why it's a custom and not a law, because if we're already impure, is it an extra prohibition to enter the cemetery? That might be why it's considered a custom and not a halacha, but I'm not sure about that. I'm not a rabbi, so this requires further research. I don't know this stuff offhand. Krista, I love being at the Kotel a few times last November, right? Meaning the wall, the holy wall, the Western Wall. And right now there's a thank you note to God for the accidental Talmudist community, because you put notes in, between the stones and the kotel. That's so beautiful, Christo. Thank you. I couldn't resist thinking of you while I was there. I'm really moved by that, Christo. Thank you. Thank you so much for thinking of us and for making a prayer on behalf of the whole AT community while you were there. Jonathan, did women have a different time to enter the gate of Nicanor if they were ending their nazirus, if they weren't allowed to mix in the women's courtyard? That's a great question. I don't know exactly how they did it, but yes, exactly. The same way that we prevent mixed dancing, they would prevent, mixed worship. And they made it work. I don't know exactly what the particulars of that were, but sort of like when you go, to a Passover program and a hotel is taken over by Orthodox Jews, and then the pool, will have men's hours and women's hours. Maybe they had it worked out in that way. And Bill, do you or anyone else in the class have a chapter and verse reference for the law that the altar has to have the ramp? Didn't we just see that? Wasn't it stated? Did I actually not say the numbers? And that's why you don't shave there. Let's see if I can find it quickly. It's the same idea. Wouldn't it be a degradation? And that was that derivation. Yeah, Exodus 20:23. You shall not ascend by steps to my altar. Exodus 20:23. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday. So the regular Friday time, noon Pacific.